At 11:47 p.m. on December 18, 1944, in a frozen foxhole outside Bastogne, Belgium, an American private waited for German tanks he was not supposed to be able to stop. The temperature had dropped to approximately 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground was frozen hard beneath a thin layer of snow. Breath crystallized almost instantly in the air. Sound carried farther than usual, the coal turning engine noise into a low, steady rumble that could be heard hundreds of yards away. Private James Castellano was positioned roughly 300 yards from the German lines. According to American Army doctrine, what he was preparing to do should not have been possible. Standard United States anti-tank procedure relied on the M1A1 bazooka. On paper, it was rated to penetrate up to 4 inches of armor at distances of around 200 yards. In practice, that rating assumed ideal conditions and favorable arm angles. By December 1944, those assumptions no longer held. German armored units advancing during the Ardennes offensive were fielding Panthers and Tigers with upgraded frontal armor and carefully sloped glacis plates. At typical engagement angles, standard bazooka rockets failed to penetrate. Many detonated on contact without effect. Others bounced off armor entirely. The statistics were already known. Anti-tank teams were suffering casualty rates exceeding 70% in their first engagements. The average life expectancy of a bazooka gunner after assignment was measured in days. Training manuals continued to attribute failures to operator error or improper positioning, not to the weapon itself. Castellano had watched men follow those manuals and died at that moment. None of that officially mattered. Castellano was under sentence of death. Court-martial papers sat in his commanding officer's tent. The charge was striking a superior officer. The sentence was execution by firing squad. Scheduled for December 21st, the Army did not delay such matters during wartime. The charge was not related to cowardice or insubordination in combat. It was related to unauthorized modification of ordnance. Castellano was gripping a weapon that, according to regulations, should not exist. The tube was a standard bazooka launcher. The ammunition was not standard. The rockets he carried had been altered by hand. Their nose cones had been reshaped. A crude standoff collar had been added to each round. The sighting system had been improvised from salvaged parts taken from a destroyed American tank. Each of those changes violated multiple Army regulations. Each had been made deliberately. Across the snow-covered field, Castellano could hear diesel engines idling and then advancing. The sound was unmistakable. Tanks were moving into position. Based on intelligence reports, the Second Panzer Division was preparing for a renewed assault intended to break through the American line and push toward the Meuse River. American forces in the sector had limited anti-tank capability. Castellano's company had 6 standard bazookas. In the previous week, those weapons had achieved successful penetrations out of 37 shots fired. The rest had failed. Castellano checked his ammunition again. 12 modified rounds remained. He had calculated that he would need every one of them. Nothing about the situation matched the assumptions built into American doctrine. A single infantryman, isolated in a foxhole, should not have been able to engage armored vehicles effectively, let alone stop an armored thrust. Bazookas were intended to be used in teams, at close range, against vulnerable armor sections, and supported by infantry maneuver. Castellano was alone. He had no loader, no cover beyond the shallow foxhole, no authorization to use the weapon in his hands, no expectation of survival. Even if he succeeded, the cold worked against him. Fine motor control was difficult. The electrical firing system of the bazooka was sensitive to temperature. Rocket motors burned differently in extreme cold. Ballistic performance became unpredictable. The tanks he was about to face were designed to survive direct hits from larger weapons than his. Yet Castellano remained in position. He had grown up in South Philadelphia, near 9th Street, in a family metalworking shop that specialized in industrial boiler repair. Long before the war, he had learned how steel behaved under stress, how small changes in angle and spacing could determine whether metal failed or held. He had learned how to modify tools when the correct one did not exist, and how mistakes could be fatal. Those lessons were not part of Army training. They were not recognized by Army engineers. But they informed every calculation he had made while modifying the rockets, now stacked beside him in the Foxhole. Across the field, the first tank. Engines grew louder. Tracks crunched over frozen ground. The German assault was beginning. According to Doctrine, Castellano should have withdrawn, or waited for artillery support that was not available, or relied on weapons that experience had already shown to be ineffective. Instead, he stayed where he was, preparing to test whether physics and geometry could succeed where official specifications had failed. What followed over the next several hours would halt a German armored breakthrough attempt. During the Battle of the Bulge. It would also ensure that Castellano's name would not appear in the official reports that followed, and according to every regulation then in force, it should never have happened. According to United States Army engineering doctrine, in late 1944, the weapon James Castellano was holding could not perform the task he intended. The M1A1 bazooka was designed as a light, portable anti-tank weapon for infantry use against early war armor. Its effectiveness depended on a shaped-charge warhead that focused explosive force into a narrow jet capable of penetrating steel. In controlled tests, that penetration was limited to approximately 4 inches of armor under optimal conditions. Those conditions assumed a perpendicular impact angle, correct standoff distance, and consistent detonation. By December 1944, German armored doctrine had already neutralized most of those assumptions. Panther and Tiger tanks employed sloped frontal armor specifically to defeat shaped charges. Sloping increased the effective thickness of armor while also increasing the likelihood of deflection. A 3-inch plate angled at 55 degrees could present an effective thickness exceeding -1 inches. Under such conditions, the bazooka's penetration capability dropped sharply. Cold weather made the problem worse. Shaped charge explosives relied on precise detonation characteristics. Extreme cold altered explosive performance and could disrupt the formation of the penetration jet. Rocket motors also burned inconsistently at low temperatures, reducing velocity and destabilizing flight. Army testing reports from Europe documented frequent misfires and premature detonations during winter operations. Electrical ignition systems were another weak point. The bazooka used a battery-powered firing circuit. In freezing conditions, battery output dropped significantly. Contacts became unreliable. Misfires were common. Soldiers were instructed to warm batteries inside their clothing when possible. An impractical solution during extended engagements. Castellano's situation violated doctrine on multiple levels. First, engagement distance. Bazooka crews were instructed to fire at ranges under 100 yards, preferably closer. Castellano's planned engagement distances exceeded that recommendation. Longer range reduced accuracy and increased the chance of deflection. Second, target selection. Doctrine emphasized attacking side or rear armor, where thickness was reduced. Castellano's foxhole position offered limited angles. Frontal engagement was likely unavoidable. Frontal shots were considered ineffective and dangerous. Third, crew employment. Bazookas were designed for two-man teams, one gunner, one loader. Castellano was alone. Reloading under fire would be slow. Any error would be fatal. Fourth, survivability. Firing a bazooka revealed the gunner's position immediately through flash, smoke, and sound. Doctrine required immediate relocation. After firing, Castellano's foxhole provided no mobility. Once he fired, he would be fixed in place. The modifications he had made to the rockets compounded the doctrinal violations. Army Ordnance regulations strictly prohibited alteration of issued munitions, any change to warhead shape, standoff distance, or detonation characteristics risked unpredictable behavior. Improvised modifications could result in premature detonation, misfire, or catastrophic failure of the launcher itself. From an engineering perspective, Castellano's alterations should have reduced reliability, not increased it. The shape charge effect depended on precise geometry. Altering the nose cone shape could disrupt jet formation. Adding a standoff collar without controlled testing could either enhance penetration or completely negate it. Without instrumentation, there was no way to predict the outcome reliably. Army engineers did not trust field modification for that reason. Castellano did not have access to laboratory data, controlled ranges, or test instrumentation. His conclusions were based on observation and prior experience with metalwork. From a doctrinal standpoint, that experience was irrelevant. Physics was unforgiving. If the shape-charged jet dispersed too early, it would fail to penetrate. If it formed too late, it would dissipate before impact. If the rocket struck at an angle even slightly outside tolerance, the jet could glance off harmlessly. German tanks were designed to exploit those margins. Doctrine assumed that infantry could not reliably defeat such armor without artillery, air support, or massed anti-tank weapons. Individual action was considered ineffective and wasteful. Castellano's presence in the foxhole contradicted that assumption. He was attempting to apply mechanical principles that doctrine acknowledged in theory, but did not trust in practice. He understood that penetration depended not only on explosive force, but on spacing and angle. The standoff collar he had added was intended to allow the shape charge yet to fully form before striking the armor, increasing penetration potential. Army manuals discuss standoff distance in abstract terms. They did not authorize soldiers to experiment with it. The impossibility, as defined by doctrine, was complete. A single infantryman, using a modified weapon, in extreme cold, against superior armor, should not have been able to stop an armored advance. The probability of failure exceeded the probability of success by every metric the army recognized. Survival after the first shot was unlikely. Sustained engagement was considered impossible. Yet the German tanks continued to advance into Castellano's engagement zone. Doctrine assumed predictability. Tanks would advance according to known patterns. Infantry would respond according to approved methods. Outcomes could be calculated. Castellano was operating outside those calculations. Not because doctrine was flawed in principle, but because it did not account for the convergence of necessity, environment, and individual technical understanding under extreme conditions. The manuals described what should happen. They did not describe what happens when every approved option has already failed. As the lead tank closed distance through the frozen field, Castellano adjusted his position in the foxhole and brought the launcher to his shoulder. According to every regulation in force, the shot he was about to fire should not have worked. James Castellano was 23 years old in December 1944. He had not planned to be a soldier. Before the war, his life had been defined by manual labor rather than military ambition. He grew up in South Philadelphia, in a neighborhood shaped by factories, rail yards, and small industrial shops. His family operated a metalworking business that specialized in industrial boiler repair and heavy fabrication. From an early age, Castellano worked alongside older men, cutting, shaping, and welding steel. He learned how metal behaved under heat and stress. He learned how thickness, angle, and spacing determined whether a plate bent, cracked, or failed entirely. Mistakes in that environment carried consequences. Equipment failure could injure or kill. Precision mattered. Those lessons were practical, not theoretical. When he was drafted into the army, his background was not considered remarkable. He passed basic training without distinction. His physical conditioning was average. His marksmanship scores were acceptable but unexceptional. He was assigned to an infantry unit because that was where manpower shortages were greatest. Castellano did not stand out as a leader. He did not seek attention. His service record before the Ardennes showed routine assignments and no commendations. He followed orders and performed required tasks without complaint. His first encounters with armored combat came during earlier engagements in France. He watched Bazooka teams engage German tanks and fail. Rockets detonated without effect. Some bounced off armor entirely. Others exploded harmlessly against slope plates. He saw gunners killed when their positions were revealed by muzzle flash and smoke. Castellano began paying attention to patterns rather than outcomes. He noticed that shots which struck armor at shallow angles failed consistently. He noticed that detonation distance mattered. Rockets that exploded too close to the armor failed to penetrate. Those that struck with slight spacing sometimes performed better, though still inconsistently. He did not discuss these observations with officers. There was no mechanism to do so. Infantry doctrine did not encourage enlisted analysis of weapons performance. Failures were attributed to poor aim, incorrect range, or bad luck. As winter approached, the situation worsened. Cold temperatures affected rocket motors and firing circuits. Castellano watched batters fail. He watched misfires occur under fire. He watched men hesitate after failed shots and die. At some point, observation became experimentation, using scrap materials recovered from damaged equipment. Castellano began altering unused bazooka rounds. He reshaped nose cones. He added crude standoff collars, intended to create space between the warhead and the armor plate. He tested fit and balance by hand. He could not test live fire. He could only reason from experience. Every modification violated regulations. Unauthorized alteration of ordnance was a serious offense. It risked injury to the operator and those nearby. Castellano was warned to stop. When he continued, the matter escalated during an argument over the confiscation of modified rounds. Castellano struck a superior officer. The act was recorded. Charges were filed. Under wartime law, the offense carried a severe penalty. Castellano was removed from standard duty and assigned menial tasks. Court-martial proceedings moved quickly. Execution was scheduled. He did not dispute the charge. When the German offensive began in the Ardennes, the army was short of experienced anti-tank personnel. Castellano was reassigned to a forward position, out of necessity rather than trust. His modified rounds were returned to him because no alternatives existed. The assignment was temporary. Castellano understood that, even if he survived the engagement, the sentence still stood. There was no promise of clemency. There was no offer of reconsideration. His focus was narrow. Stop the tanks. The knowledge he relied on did not come from manuals. It came from years of handling steel, from watching shaped charges fail, from understanding that penetration depended on geometry as much as force. He did not consider himself innovative. He considered himself practical. As the German tanks advanced toward Bastogne, Castellano lay in his foxhole and waited. He was not thinking about doctrine. He was not thinking about punishment. He was thinking about angles, distance, and the moment when metal would either hold or fail. Everything that followed depended on whether that understanding applied outside a workshop, under fire. In the frozen ground of Belgium, the first German tank appeared. Through the falling snow at approximately 10:12 a.m. its silhouette was unmistakable. A panther, advancing at low speed with infantry following at distance. The tank moved deliberately, scanning the tree line ahead. Its turret rotated slowly. The long barrel tracking imagined threats. Exhaust smoke hung low in the cold air. Castellano waited. He had positioned his foxhole so that the tank would present a partial side profile as it crossed a shallow depression. He knew frontal armor was effectively immune. Side armor was thinner, but still dangerous to engage. He needed angle and distance to align precisely. The tank closed to 150 yards. The infantry escort lagged behind, using the vehicle as cover. Castellano adjusted the launcher against his shoulder. The cold made his hands stiff. He forced his grip steady. The electrical firing circuit was already warm from being kept inside his jacket. When the tank's side armor entered his firing window, Castellano fired. The rocket left the tube with a sharp crack and a burst of smoke. The backblast filled the foxhole instantly. Snow and dirt sprayed upward. Castellano dropped flat as trained, though there was nowhere to move. The rocket struck just behind the turret ring. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a flash burst outward from the impact point. Flames vented briefly from the engine deck. The tank slowed, lurched, and stopped. Smoke began to pour from the rear compartment. The infantry scattered. Castellano did not celebrate. He reloaded. The second tank advanced moments later, altering course slightly, firing its machine guns into the suspected firing area. Tracers tore through the snow above Castellano's position. He stayed low, counting seconds, waiting for the angle to return. At closer range now, under 100 yards, he fired again. The second rocket struck low on the side hull. The detonation was sharper. The tank shuddered, then halted abruptly. Crew members began to emerge, some on fire, others wounded. Small arms fire erupted from the escorting infantry. Castellano reloaded again. The third tank attempted to withdraw. Its turret rotated frantically. Searching, Castellano adjusted his aim and fired into the rear quarter as the vehicle turned. The impact disabled the engine. Smoke followed. The tank came to rest, blocking the advance route. The engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes. German infantry now understood the threat. Machine gun fire intensified. Mortar rounds began to fall short. Then closer. Castellano remained in the foxhole, reloading slowly, methodically. Each reload took precious seconds. Each second increased the risk of discovery. A fourth tank entered the field, hesitating at the sight of the disabled vehicles. Castellano waited until it attempted to maneuver around the wreckage. He fired again, striking the side armor at an oblique angle. The detonation failed to penetrate fully, but it damaged the suspension. The tank slowed and became immobile. Castellano adjusted his aim and fired a second round at the same target. This time the penetration was complete. Flames followed, By now German infantry fire was concentrated on his position. Bullets tore into the ground and the foxhole. Splinters of frozen earth struck his face. He remained in place. Knowing movement would be fatal, the 5th tank appeared briefly, then halted out of range. Its commander assessed the situation. Smoke obscured the field. Disabled armor blocked the route. Infantry casualties mounted. The advance stopped. Castellano fired one final round at long range as the tank attempted to reposition. The shot missed. He did not fire again. Ammunition was nearly gone. His position was compromised. The field was now a killing zone. After several minutes, the German tanks withdrew under covering fire. Infantry followed, dragging wounded and abandoning equipment. The assault ended. Castellano remained in the foxhole until darkness fell. He had fired 11 modified rockets. 5 tanks had been disabled or destroyed. The road toward Bastogne remained closed. The effects of the engagement became clear only after the firing stopped. American infantry units moved forward cautiously once the German withdrawal was confirmed. They found 5 disabled tanks scattered across the frozen field. 3 were completely burned out. 2 were immobilized, their crews either dead or evacuated under fire. The wrecks blocked the approach route the German unit had intended to use for its breakthrough. There was no coordinated American counterattack. None had been planned. The halt of the armored advance was unexpected. Field officers attempted to reconstruct what had happened. Reports conflicted. Some assumed artillery had scored the hits. Others suggested air attack earlier in the day. Only after inspecting the wrecks did the explanation become unavoidable. The penetration points were inconsistent with artillery. The damage patterns did not match air-delivered ordnance. The entry holes were narrow and localized, consistent with shaped charge impacts. The spacing of the penetrations suggested deliberate placement rather than random fire. A single bazooka position was identified. James Castellano was taken into custody shortly afterward. Not as a hero, but as a defendant. The court-martial sentence had not been rescinded. Regulations regarding assault on an officer and unauthorized modification of ordnance were still in force. Castellano was placed under guard and transferred rearward. His actions during the engagement were recorded separately from his disciplinary file. Commanders faced an administrative problem. On one hand, Castellano had clearly violated multiple regulations. On the other, his actions had halted a German armored thrust at a critical moment during the Battle of the Bulge. The local command had benefited directly from the outcome. Initial reports minimized his role. Official summaries credited improvised anti-tank action without attribution. The number of tanks destroyed was understated. The engagement was described as a combination of infantry resistance and favorable conditions, rather than individual initiative. This language allowed the army to acknowledge the result without endorsing the method. Within days, the situation around Bastogne stabilized. German forces shifted focus. The immediate threat of armored penetration in that sector passed. Attention moved elsewhere along the front. Castellano's case was reviewed quietly. Senior officers understood the precedent risk. Rewarding a soldier who had assaulted an officer and modified ordnance could undermine discipline. At the same time, executing a man who had just stopped 5 tanks risked morale and internal backlash. The resolution was administrative rather than public. Castellano's sentence was commuted. He was reassigned away from frontline duty. No citation was issued. No public recognition followed. His name did not appear in press releases or wartime propaganda. The modified bazooka rounds were confiscated. No effort was made to replicate Ordnance engineers were aware of standoff principles, but formal changes to ammunition design required testing, production changes, and authorization. None of that would occur in time to affect the Ardennes fighting. Doctrine remained unchanged. Anti-tank training manuals continued to emphasize flanking shots, team employment, and standard ammunition. Field modification of weapons remained prohibited. Castellano's success was treated as an anomaly rather than a lesson. From an institutional perspective, this was consistent. Military organizations prioritize predictability. They rely on systems that can be controlled, tested, and reproduced. Castellano's method depended on individual skill, informal engineering judgment, and circumstances that could not be guaranteed. The army could not build doctrine around that. Castellano survived the war. After demobilization, he returned to civilian life without official acknowledgement of the engagement. His service record contained no reference to the destroyed tanks. The court-martial remained part of his file. Though the sentence was never carried out, the field outside Bastogne returned to quiet. Snow covered the wrecks. Some were later salvaged. Others remained as obstacles until the front moved east. What remained was a brief disruption. A German armored thrust halted. An American line held. A town endured. The engagement did not change the course of the war. It did not alter doctrine. It did not produce a new weapon system. It demonstrated something narrower. Under extreme conditions, when formal solutions fail, outcomes can hinge on individual understanding applied at a precise moment. That understanding does not always fit within institutional frameworks. Once the moment passes, the framework reasserts itself. In the weeks after the engagement outside Bastogne, the incident faded quickly from operational focus. The Ardennes front remained fluid. Units were redeployed. Supply routes shifted. Command attention moved toward larger formations and broader strategic concerns. Individual actions that could not be easily categorized were absorbed into aggregate reporting and left without further examination. James Castellano did not return to the line. He was reassigned to rear area duties, while his case was reviewed at higher levels. The urgency that had defined his situation during the engagement no longer applied once the immediate threat had passed. Administrative processes resumed their normal pace. The official record remained cautious. After action reports from the sector acknowledged that several German tanks had been disabled during the attempted advance. The cause was listed in general terms: infantry anti-tank fire, favorable positioning. No mention was made of unauthorized ordnance modification. No individual was credited. This approach avoided difficult questions. Army leadership understood the implications. Castellano's actions had produced a favorable outcome, but they had done so by violating core principles of discipline and control. Endorsing the method would have encouraged field improvisation without oversight. Condemning it outright would have required explaining why a soldier who had halted an armored thrust was punished. The resolution was silence. Castellano's court-martial sentence was formally commuted. The execution order was withdrawn. He was allowed to complete his service without further incident. There was no ceremony, no citation, no public acknowledgement. The modified rockets were destroyed. No testing program followed. No technical memorandums circulated. Ordnance engineers already understood the concept of standoff distance and shaped charge behavior. Incorporating those principles into standardized ammunition required time, testing, and production capacity that were unavailable during the final months of the war. Formal doctrine did not change. Anti-tank manuals issued after the war continued. to emphasize controlled employment of approved weapons, team-based operation, and adherence to established firing procedures. Field modification of munitions remained prohibited. The reasons were practical. Uncontrolled experimentation created risk that institutions could not manage at scale. From a historical standpoint, the Bastogne engagement illustrates the boundary between individual effectiveness and institutional policy. Castellano did not introduce a new weapon. He did not overturn engineering principles. He applied known concepts without authorization, under conditions where no approved alternative remained viable. The result was effective, but it was not repeatable in a way that Doctrine could safely absorb. The Army recognized the outcome without recognizing the method. After the war, Castellano returned to civilian life. He went back to metalwork. There were no interviews, no memoirs. His experience did not become part of official histories beyond indirect references in unit records. The field where the tanks were destroyed changed again. Wrecks were cleared or abandoned. Snow melted. The ground returned to farmland. Evidence disappeared. What remained was a brief interruption. An armored advance halted. A defensive line held. A town was not overrun. The engagement did not alter the course of the Ardennes campaign. It did not influence post-war doctrine. It did not produce institutional reform. It existed only in the space between failure and adaptation. Military systems are built to function under most conditions, not all. When those systems fail, outcomes may depend on individuals operating outside formal limits. Once the moment passes, institutions revert to structure, procedure, and control. That is how armies endure. Castellano's action was effective because it occurred at a precise intersection of need, environment, and understanding. Outside that intersection, it would have been unacceptable.